Welcome, everyone, to another episode of We Are Being Transformed. This is a podcast that, contrary to popular rumor, is not a Transformers-oriented show. We do not do unboxings of Rodimus Prime here. We discuss the myriad of ways in which people interact with and are changed by their culture, whether that be ritual, myth, lore, legend, or religion, for lack of a better term. And our guest today is a man who knows a thing or two about the Emperor Julian. Dr. Jeremy Swist, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. It's been a busy week, but I always am happy to talk about Julian and his world.
Yeah, it's kind of like me with Lucian of Samosata. Like, there's never a time not to talk about Lucian, right? So
True
I
story.
assume this is, yeah, exactly. True story is awesome. So we're going to talk about a figure who is very polarizing. Strangely enough, also somebody who, while being used for this person or that person's personal agenda, we know very little, like in terms of the general public, about this person's life. When we hear something like Julian the Emperor, Julian the Apostate, we have a certain idea in our head that's created through, church fathers, the accidents of transmission through history. So if you could just kind of give us a little overview of who Julian was, then we can kind of get more into um, the weeds with it, so to speak.
You're right that Julian the Emperor, or Julian the Apostate, as I think he's being called less and less now, because that is a derogatory term that Christian authors did impose on him. Is not a household name, and you can say that's kind of a general thing with late antiquity, right? A lot of people are brought up, at least traditionally, on this idea that, there was antiquity, then the Roman Empire fell, and then there were the Middle Ages, starting with the so-called Dark Ages. And late antiquity is when people start learning about it, they kind of realize, wait a minute, history doesn't quite work that way. You don't just, suddenly we're in the Middle Ages, right? This is a period of very gradual transition in which a lot of elements from the past, from, Greco-Roman antiquity, are coming into some sort of dialogue, fusion, conflict with some new ideas, new movements, new aesthetics that are kind of early versions of what you will see in the future, certainly by the Middle Ages. And of course, one of the main things is various types of Christianity and theology, which, at that time was one of many similar takes on religion that existed at the time, including kind of the form of pagan Hellenic religion that Julian subscribed to. So, when we talk about him as an apostate, as he was called, he was not necessarily just, pulling a 180, going to a different spiritual tradition that kind of offered a lot of similar answers to him. And the thing about Julian is he saw that what these other cults had to offer him had grounding in precedent of being a much older tradition, and they were also compatible with the various types of Platonic philosophy that he was studying, and he did not see Christianity as being able to be reconcilable with these other forms of religious and philosophical thought. So that's a kind of roundabout way to talk about, Julian himself. He was an interesting situation because, if you think of one household figure from late antiquity, you think of the Emperor Constantine. The guy who, because he didn't convert the empire to Christianity overnight or make it the official religion, but mainly because he started favoring Christianity, and he reigned a long time, and his sons reigned a long time. By the time you get to the 350s, 360 CE, which would be about half a century after Constantine had the vision at the Milvian Bridge and started favoring Christianity as the god who gives him victory and who will unite the empire. Christianity really becomes the establishment religion for a lot of the political elites, because that's the religion, the favored religion of the imperial court. Yet Constantine had a nephew named Julian who comes along, and while he, as he's kind of rising up through the ranks, so to speak, of his imperial career, he is nominally a Christian, but by the time he becomes sole emperor after various fortuitous events, he says, well, wait a minute, Christianity is actually not, the religion of the future here. It's a temporary aberration. My uncle and my cousin, who ruled before me, they were misguided. And so I am going to basically reverse course here and return to the traditional. And so I am going to basically reverse course here and return to the traditional civic cults of the empire. I'm going to promote all of these traditions that people celebrate in their various cities and the country, founded in much older precedent than Christianity, which he sees as a recent innovation. In fact, he thinks of it as a sort of Jewish heresy. Started as Jews, and then they developed this whole new theology where they essentially take this one guy and who died, but they believe he resurrected. And he says it himself that they worship corpses, right? They worship one man who died, one corpse, but they also worship the relics of saints as having some sort of power. And so he refers to churches as, ossuaries or charnel houses or tombs where people tend to worship these corpses, including the corpse of the Galilean, as he calls them, and he calls them all Galileans in order to refer to the origin of this religion in this kind of provincial backwater Galilee, because his concept of religion at this time is very much classically based, where a religion is not something that is revealed from above, and a kind of a universal thing. It is something that is very much particular to specific places and specific peoples. Okay, so the Athenians have their civic cult of Athena, right? And then the Romans, right, they have their particular cults of Jupiter and Mars, and the Jews have their own kind of ethnic god who oversees them. And he did not think of that god as the universal god. He is just simply a god who is particular to that region. And so he kind of makes fun of the Galileans as Jesus is their god, even though he's not actually a god. Also, from his study of philosophy, he sees this plurality of religions as also comprising a unity, because all of these different gods, all these different traditions that in all these different cities throughout the empire in forms of worship, from a philosophical point of view, can all be reconciled. And because all of these gods and these traditions are essentially emanating from a supreme god, it's a kind of it's not monotheism, it's not pure polytheism, it's somewhere in between. You might call it henotheism, is one thing that might work here, or a soft monotheism, where ultimately it's all one god, but there are various subordinate gods that emanate and receive their being from this higher god, and then these are the more particular gods who oversee these different parts of the empire. And so Julian, when he comes to power as emperor, he is kind of taking that theoretical framework and trying to put it into practice, because he genuinely sees this as the way things used to be, whereas Christianity was this religion that was essentially atheism to him, because unlike all this other plurality of religions where they accepted, the fact that people worshipped other gods, the Christians believed all these other gods were either fake, or they were demons, or they were just not gods in the sense of their God. And to Julian, he thought that that idea was tantamount to atheism,
Right.
and it was also dangerous, right?
One thing I really love about Julian as a figure, he comes up at a very volatile time in the history of the Roman Empire. The world is vastly different at the beginning of the fourth century compared to where it ends. This is kind of Western Civ 1 class, and it's just kind of like, well, this happened, and there was polytheism, paganism, then Constantine, Milvian Bridge, yada yada. Then everything becomes Christian afterwards. But we when you dig a little bit deeper, we tend to forget that things weren't always this set in stone. Like there was
Mm-hmm.
a volatile period of time where this could have gone any other way. And Julian was a great example of this because he's coming up in a time not only where these cults are established, this religion is, there's no other way many people can possibly think things could be. He's coming up at a time where you have things like Neoplatonism coming up and all these different philosophies, and they're taking uh, in this Christian stuff and they're kind of working their own little thing, right? You have the pagan holy man, as Garth
Mm-hmm.
Fowden would say. So you have things like the Chaldean oracles, and there's a huge re-emphasis in Paideia and in philosophy on the pagan, the Hellenic religions and things like that. So kind of like a reinforcement of identity. You have this kind of culture war going on in a sense. I just kind of talk a little bit about what the world that Julian inherited was like in terms of these thoughts and these kind of cultural things that are going on. You have like Neoplatonic, Yamblichian theurgy, and then you have all this other side, all this more contemplative Platonian thought, and then you have wild things like what John Dillon would call the Platonic underworld, right? The Platonic underground with like Chaldean oracles and Hermeticism, and it's just this really exciting time in terms of like culture and thought. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
we could explore that a little bit.
Yeah, a lot there. And, I think one of the most important kind of explanatory mechanisms for why you have that kind of radical change or shift, at least in terms of kind of the religious landscape between the beginning of the the beginning of the fourth century and the end, is it has very much to do with continuity. So, as I mentioned, Constantine was in power, for several decades, and so were his sons. Certainly, his son Constantius II. Julian comes along. He only reigns for 18 months, and then all the emperors after him happen to be Christian, right? And so you get to a point where, when the religion of the emperor and the court and the religion the emperor favors, is maintained, and things are maintained that way for enough time, then people get used to it. People start to kind of acquiesce in the idea that this is the new normal, right? Uh, Especially when it gets to the point where people who remembered what it was like before, say, Constantine started favoring Christianity, are no longer alive. I think a good example is when the Emperor Augustus comes to power at the beginning of the empire. He reigns for over 40 years. And Tacitus mentions this at the beginning of the Annales, where he says basically, so few people were around by the time Augustus dies who remembered the old republic. Because of that, most people alive when Augustus dies in his 70s, the world that they took to be normal was a world in which you had monarchy, essentially, right? And
Right.
you also had relative peace and prosperity during that time, at least if you were, a Roman within kind of the center of the empire. And so people were there was inertia. People just thought this is how things are, and so Tiberius succeeds, and then the whole idea of we can go back to the Republic never really happens, because nobody really knows what it's like to be under anything that isn't the emperors. And so shift back to the to the fourth century. CE, and it's like that with kind of Christianity as the religion of the establishment, right? When Julian comes to power in 360, at the end of 361, right? It has been, as I mentioned, almost a little more long as Augustus had reigned, right? Since you last had when Christianity was not favored. And so when
Absolutely.
he basically says, okay, I'm restoring the old ways, yes, you have some people, but there are very few who actually know what it's like for a non-Christian emperor to be emperor. And what you have
Right.
to rely on is basically, it's almost like he has to reconstruct what that world is based on literary sources and based on sort of kind of the evidence that's there in front of him. He almost has to be like an historian rather than just consulting people being like, how were things used to be? How did things used to be? Right. And so, some people will say that Julian came onto the scene too late. It was already at that point, the inertia had already set in. If Julian had reigned for, much longer and had a successor, who maintained his policies, regardless of what those policies were, they were not Christian. Things could have been very different.
And you even see something like with Julian's policies, like religious reforms are almost like he's taking the cue from the ecclesiastical structure he's seeing every
Hmm.
day, right, around him. So in a way, he's kind of like he's almost like when I was younger, I was a little bit after the goth scene. I grew up in the 90s, but I was really influenced by a lot of like 80s like goth bands. So like
Hmm.
I would look at the old magazines and the old books, and I would kind of try to recreate that my own little myth,
Hmm.
of that. So I think Julian's kind of doing something similar. He's in vogue, kind of Neoplatonic theurgical holy men, but he's also like looking back at a past that maybe is kind of romanticized,
Hmm.
and he's just really kind of he's being like I was kind of like a hipster with that goth stuff.
Hmm.
He's kind of like doing that with like the pagan stuff. So I
Hmm.
love that.
Use kind of your analogy here, kind of with kind of my counterculture. Like, I think here in the 2010s and now the 2020s, there's a revival in the heavy metal scene of like old school 80s style.
Right. Yeah.
And there's been a real renaissance of that. And all the vast majority of people who are into it are people who were either too young or not born in the 80s. Um, but because they're listening to the bands and being influenced from the styles from the 80s, they're kind of bringing it all back versus, the people who are actually part of the 80s, golden age. A lot of them are still around and they're taking part in it, but discontinuity of evolution. And so I kind of think of kind of Julian as someone who was young and therefore not part of kind of the pagan golden age, if you will, right? He's trying to bring it back basically based on what he has read about it, right?
Right.
Rather than what having actually known what it was like.
Equal parts romanticism versus like a genuine desire, I think, on his part to really interact with these rites and everything, and
Hmm.
he's really being influenced. So what was Julian's relation to philosophy and religion? What
Hmm.
was his paideia like? Who was he kind of who is he the stand for, in the paideia sense?
Right.
Like, who's he going to be the hero to? And
Hmm.
the one he wants to be, like, who's the person he wants to be the hieroi to the most, like.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few minutes ago kind of all the different things going on in this milieu of the mid 4th century. And you mentioned the idea of a culture war. And, while there were certainly tensions, there was certainly conflict, at, it's sort of a similar dynamic to what you might call the culture wars today, where we have strident voices on the extremes that are controlling the discourse and sort of creating the idea that, there's this clash of incompatible paradigms, whereas the majority of people who are not, at least not participating or in those extremes on either side of this discourse, right, are actually somewhere in the middle, and they're they don't they're not at war with each other, right? They don't have the sense of
The same, we're especially with historical
yeah.
documents and
Hmm.
evidence, we're not always seeing like the full picture of what life
Yes.
was like for the everyday person.
Yeah. And thankfully, in the fourth century, we don't just have the extreme views. We also have people who were in the elites who were, you know, politically and intellectually, very high up there, who were also sort of in these more middle moderate positions. And so there were radical pagans and there were radical Christians. You had fire and brimstone bishops who, like Gregory Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, and all of those who, wanted to stamp out paganism and Judaism and kind of get everybody to be believing the same thing about the nature of Christ. And, he thought that the vast majority of people in the empire, even if they were nominally Christian, they were morally, debauched people, and all of that rhetoric that you still hear, today. But you also have radical pagans who, were kind of on the other end, and Julian was actually a part of this more radical kind of faction of pagans. I'll get to that in a moment. But the vast majority of people who were either Christian or non-Christian, they didn't necessarily define their whole identity in terms of their religious affiliation. Okay, so for a lot of people at all levels of society, even at the very top in the court, in the Roman Senate or the Constantinopolitan Senate, right, you had a mixture of pagans and Christians. Okay, and what mattered to them was they had solidarity of class, they had solidarity of kind of of politics. We're all Romans, okay, before
Right.
we're all pagans or Christians, right? Those kind of economic, and
And the
class,
Paideia is especially
and the paideia is the other
mhm,
thing, right? We have
right.
a common culture based around this education system in rhetoric that is fueled by this canon of classical literature. Okay, and even though this canon is by pagan, non-Christian authors, the Christians are still engaged with it and working with it very much like people who are Christian today are classicists, right? Or are reading and learning and engaging with classical texts. Same idea. We have people like Themistius, right? He is kind of represents kind of this he's like a tolerant pagan who is, he works with the Christian emperors to kind of create this environment in which there's this harmony, right? Um, and you also have Christians, okay, who, are not churchmen, who are not bishops, right, who are also, and even emperors who are Christian, a lot of them in this century they realize that in order to have political stability, you have to work with people who don't share your religion, because especially for people like Constantine and Constantius and Valentinian and even Theodosius, right,
Right.
even though they might, pay lip service to kind of the extreme kind of Christianity is, should be everybody's religion, there's still many pagans, right, are, in the elite class, and they need these people to run the empire together, right? There needs to be a consensus.
Right. It
Go
just
ahead.
brought up a thought, like, with
Mhm.
Constantine himself, he really exemplified that the majority of his reign. And really, I think a lot of people conflate what his sons later did, like Constance and
Mhm.
Constantius II. Like, they were very much like, we need to push this, and this is what it needs to be.
Mhm.
Constance is like favoring Christian rhetorical teachers like Prohiresius, right?
Mhm.
And but Constantine himself, like you were saying, he's very pragmatic. He's got Platonist philosophers at his court, just
Yep.
like he's got like the Christian bishop. So
So now let's talk about kind of what Julian comes up as. Now, he starts with, traditional, elite Greco-Roman education. He grows up in the Greek East, and basically after he gets his ABCs, he's starting to read Homer, right? And they start with Homer and kind of mythological literature, poetry, and then he moves on to studying other literature and also learning rhetoric, learning compositional exercises, right? How to write a good argument, learning the various forms of literary genres, and especially oratory for various occasions. And of course, at this time, epideictic or kind of panegyrical encomiastic oratory is very much in vogue because they're under a monarchy, and sort of that's how you have to kind of communicate with that way. He masters these styles under various teachers and rhetoricians in Asia Minor, where he's growing up. But eventually, and he's also, of course, learning the Bible. He's learning Christian theology. Some of his tutors were Christian bishops, and so he became very well versed in that as well, regardless of whether he really was a devout Christian at any point. There's a lot of debate over whether he was ever really Christian at all, or he was just sort of nominally a Christian until he didn't have to be anymore. That's a question that is we can't there isn't really a lot that we can say about it.
Yeah, we can't know either way,
because again, his earliest writings are from 355, when he's already in his mid-20s. We don't know. But at some point, as he is studying rhetoric, he becomes more and more interested in philosophy. Natural, because especially the rhetoricians that he's learning from, like Libanius, Plato's dialogues are considered, not just works of philosophy, they're also considered models of good prose literature, right? And if you ever read Plato's dialogues, you can see that this isn't just a philosophical treatise. This is a dramatized kind of situation.
Yeah, it really is a drama in anything but name.
And they're just fun to read. At least some of them are, like the Symposium, right? And I'm
partial to the Phaedrus myself.
Yeah. Oh, and so was Julian. Trust me. So Plato's dialogues were taught, as literary models. But also, they were also had various moral philosophy. The moral philosophy of it was also, very appealing. And of course, Platonic philosophy and Christianity certainly found ways to reconcile them with each other. He becomes more interested in Platonic philosophy, and he starts seeking out teachers of Platonism, and at this point we call the Platonism is Neoplatonism, right? So there's really kind of two branches of Neoplatonism that are kind of coexisting and sort of at this time. And one is the kind of the original Platinian Porphyrian kind of school, where it emphasizes kind of individual rational contemplation and the ability and kind of one's inherent divinity, and the ability of somebody through dialectical reasoning and contemplation and purification to ascend and reconnect with the higher principles and eventually achieve kind of union with the highest principle of the one. Types of philosophers, these kind of the Platinian school, they see kind of traditional religion as useful and good for its sort of instrumental kind of functions, its utilitarian functions, if you will. But they themselves kind of understand the world working kind of more in terms of, Platonist rationalist metaphysics, right? While the Platinian Porphyrian school sort of has kind of a mysticism and sort of a spiritual kind of bent to it, much more than, say, traditional Platonism, they are not going so far as to kind of unify philosophy and religion. Until you get Iamblichus of Chalcis coming along, who is probably a student of Porphyry, who was a student of Plotinus, and It's with the Iamblichian school that you see much more of a tendency towards a synthesis with traditional pagan religion. And the reason for that is it has to do with this thing called this theory of the descended soul. Right? So for somebody like Plotinus and that school, you have a rational soul and you have an irrational soul. Okay, there's parts of the soul. Okay, and Plotinus thought that while our lower irrational souls are kind of engaged with this material world, right? Our rational souls, kind of the divine element within us, is actually always up in the world of forms, if you will, up in the immaterial world. Okay, and that we're connected to it, and kind of the idea is to identify with that higher form of the soul more and more to the point where that's all we become and we unite with the first principle. That explains why a Platinian Neoplatonist sees themselves as at least theoretically capable of achieving personal salvation through the practice of, theoretical philosophy. Iamblichus comes along and says, no, the entire human soul descends, from the gods, and our rational soul, our irrational soul, all together descends entirely. It's all, begins, kind of trapped in embodiment in this material world. A result of that is Iamblichus thought that the human soul, a human being by themselves, is actually incapable of achieving salvation and ascending back to the gods by themselves, by their own efforts. Philosophy, at least traditional rational philosophy, is not enough. You need religion. You need the gods to help you reascend to them. Because the gods, exactly, the gods are so transcendent of this realm, that they just do not come into contact with this realm by any stretch. And we are so separated from the realm of the gods, to the point where, in order for the gods to have any influence on this realm, which of course they control this realm entirely, but they don't contact it directly. There's a hierarchy of inferior divinities,
daimones.
The daimones, the heroes, the pure souls, the angels, right? There's this hierarchy of superior beings that are superior to human beings, to human souls, but they are inferior to the gods. And this is sort of this chain of being, right? The gods' influence, their illumination, their power is kind of filtered down through them, but also this chain of superior beings is also the ladder, right, by which the human soul can ascend. However, in order to achieve that ascent, yes, practicing philosophy, purifying oneself morally is important and necessary. However, that's only sort of a preparatory practice. You actually need to engage in various forms of ritual that the gods had prescribed, by communicating through the ancients, right? The ancient oracles, if you will. The Chaldean oracles are sort of a later version of that sort of divine communication, right? Through various prophets, through various oracle sites, etc. Right. Ancient oracles essentially prescribed forms of ritual practice, that someone who has purified themselves can engage in order to achieve that salvation, to lift their soul up to communion with the gods. And whereas the Platinians would think of this kind of ascent and return to the gods as a form of divinization, right? You actually literally fuse with the first principle and become God yourself. And a human soul, regardless of how much it ascends and purifies itself, it always stays a human soul ontologically. It never actually becomes a god. It can't. okay, ontologically.
It doesn't
Right.
get fused
However,
with the one or
it
anything.
doesn't get fused, but it can come into communion with, right? Um, and contemplate the higher being, and that's about as good as you can get. Okay, is how an Iamblichean would call divinization, right? To be a theos on air is someone who is capable of, through the practice of these ritual acts, to ascend that far. And so those ritual acts are theurgy. Okay? And the thing about theurgy is you tend to think of theurgy as like, oh, the Chaldean oracles prescribe this sort of practices that are completely different than anything you've seen in religion. And while, yes, there's some special practices that like the higher theurgists and the adepts kind of practice, you can really think of any sort of religious ritual that involves prayer, sacrifice, and anything that requires contact with the gods, as a form of theurgy, like maybe a lower
Right.
form of theurgy. Okay.
Right. So not everybody is animating statues, but
Yeah,
people can pray, people can meditate, do things like that.
exactly.
So
Exactly. And the point of theurgy, as you mentioned, I think, is it is theos, God, ergon, work, God activity. It's divine activity. In other words, by practicing theurgy, you are assimilating yourself to the gods or imitating the gods in some way by participating in their activity. You're becoming more godlike by doing the things that the gods do. Okay. And so this is how Iamblichus and his school and Julian after him are able to provide a Neoplatonic, as they see it, rational framework in which all traditional religion makes sense theoretically. Okay? Because every traditional religion came into being through oracles that communicated from whatever particular god was in charge in that particular place, told them how to conduct worship. Right. Whereas Julian is not trying to impose a single religion or catechism or doctrine. Okay, he simply subscribes to a philosophical school that sees all traditional religion as essentially doing the same thing. All of these gods that they worship are essentially emanations of the higher god, that is, the one intellect, one being, descending from there.
I guess in philosophical terms, it's almost like a perennialist
Mhm.
kind of view of religion and theology and things like
Mhm.
that. It's they take the Stoic kind of allegorical method that you have in
Mhm.
Cornutus, and then they kind of take it to
Yep.
their own, and they apply that towards religions,
Mhm.
and you find that in Philo and the Middle Platonic stuff. But then, yeah, it really gets going with
Mhm.
Plotinus and
Yep.
Porphyry. So like, yeah, like you
Yep.
said, there's two different groups, and I don't think I'd ever see Porphyry animate a statue, but
Yeah.
Iamblichus certainly would, and
Yep.
the people who follow in his footsteps, they certainly would, and they're looking at that. You
Mhm.
mentioned the Theos honor. Of course, the paradigm for that divine
Mhm.
holy man is, of course, Apollonius of Tyana,
Yep.
who Julian's seeing all this stuff, and these are basically like the rock stars, the rock stars of his day, right? He's like,
Yep.
I want to animate statues like Maximus or whatever.
Yeah.
So I love that. It's like what he's doing. With his social and religious forms, I kind of liken it to like when he gets in charge, he's almost like an oil tycoon. And he goes and makes this like all-star basketball team of Platonic philosophers and things like that. He just like brings them all over, and
Yep.
like he surrounds himself with his entourage. I
Mhm.
really love that. I think like he's like a crunk rapper with all his like entourage of like really smart dudes who are like animating statues and trying to fend off earthquakes and stuff. I just love it. Dr. Swiss, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure. We hope to have you again sometime. You have an amazing evening. Thank you.
You too. Thank you.